He crowned someone else while I was standing close enough to hear the room applaud. 6 hours later, Alexander Hayes opened the door to my room and finally understood what that applause had cost him. By then I was gone. My closet was nearly empty, my travel bag was missing, and the small silver pendant Alexander had given me 3 years earlier rested in the center of the desk. I left no letter because there was nothing I could write that his decision had not already said for me. Earlier that evening, I had entered Blackridge Hall believing my life was about to change for the better. I was 27, still recovering from an injury that had kept me away from several pack gatherings, but I had refused to miss the coronation. Alexander and I had spent 5 years building a life in the spaces between his responsibilities as Alpha. He had never formally promised that I would become Luna, but there had been quiet conversations about standing together, serving the pack together, and creating a future neither of us would have to hide. I believed those conversations meant something. Then Madeline Cross walked into the ceremonial hall wearing silver and midnight blue. She was poised, calm, and surrounded by members of the Cross family, one of Blackridge's most important allies. I knew immediately that something was wrong. Alexander stood at the front of the hall in a dark formal suit, his expression controlled enough that nobody else would have noticed the tension in his face. I noticed. I always noticed. When the council called Madeline forward, I waited for Alexander to stop them. He did not. When the ceremonial Luna insignia was presented, I waited for him to explain. He did not. Then Alexander placed it into Madeline's hands, and hundreds of people rose in approval. I remained seated because standing suddenly felt impossible. Across the room, Alexander found me in the crowd. Our eyes met. For 1 second, everything else disappeared. He looked almost apologetic, as though he expected me to understand something he had never bothered to tell me. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I did not confront Madeline because she had made me no promises. I did not interrupt the ceremony because humiliation did not need an audience to become real. I simply walked out. Back in my room, I changed into jeans, a sweater, and the warmest coat I owned. I packed identification, cash, medication, 2 changes of clothes, and the sketchbook I had carried since college. Everything else could remain. At 11:40 that night, I drove through the Blackridge gates without telling anyone where I was going. The road ahead disappeared beneath miles of darkness, but uncertainty felt strangely cleaner than staying somewhere I had become replaceable. I did not know where I would sleep the following week, or what kind of life waited beyond Blackridge. I knew only one thing with absolute certainty. Alexander had chosen his Luna in front of everyone. Now I was choosing myself where nobody could applaud. Long before I drove away from Blackridge, Alexander had already made the choice that would send me there. I simply had not known it yet. 3 months before the coronation, the Blackridge Council began pressuring him to strengthen the Pack's alliance with the Cross family. Their territory bordered ours to the west, their businesses supported hundreds of local families, and several council members believed a formal union would guarantee stability for years. Alexander listened because that was what he had been trained to do since becoming Alpha at 30. He measured risk, considered consequences, and carried responsibility as if admitting uncertainty would weaken everyone depending on him. I had once admired that discipline. I never imagined he would eventually use it to justify excluding me from my own future. At home, nothing appeared dramatically different. Alexander still brought me coffee on Sunday mornings. He still asked about my physical therapy after the accident that had injured my shoulder. Some evenings he sat beside me while I sketched and quietly reviewed council reports. Those ordinary moments convinced me we were safe. One night, while rain tapped against the windows, I asked whether he ever regretted becoming Alpha so young. Alexander looked at me and said, "Only when it makes me choose between what I want and what everyone expects." I should have asked what he meant. Instead, I reached across the couch and took his hand. "You do not have to choose everything alone." He squeezed my fingers and answered, "I know." That was the lie that hurt most later because I believed him. Alexander met privately with Madeline Cross twice during the following month. When I asked about the meetings, He called them alliance negotiations. Technically, that was true. What he did not tell me was that the council had proposed naming Madeleine Luna as part of the agreement. According to what I learned later, Alexander initially refused. Then border disputes threatened trade agreements, council pressure increased, and he convinced himself that accepting the arrangement was temporary political necessity. He also convinced himself that I would understand once he explained everything after the coronation. He never asked whether I wanted to understand. He never gave me the dignity of deciding what I could forgive. While Alexander negotiated my replacement, I was preparing something entirely different. During the weeks I spent recovering, I had written a short speech because I believed the upcoming ceremony would finally acknowledge what we had built together. I wrote about loyalty that existed beyond rank, about leadership requiring trust, and about standing beside someone because both people had chosen the same future. I practiced it alone until the words stopped sounding nervous. On the afternoon of the coronation, I folded that speech and slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat. Alexander saw me before the ceremony began. For a moment, relief crossed his face. "You came," he said. "Of course I came." I smiled because I still believed I belonged there. He looked as though he wanted to tell me something, but a council member called his name. "We will talk afterward," Alexander promised. I nodded. Less than 2 hours later, I watched him place the Luna insignia into another person's hands. By midnight, my speech was still folded inside my coat as I drove farther from Blackridge. Alexander had believed he could explain his choice afterward. What he had never considered was that by then, I might no longer be there to hear it. By sunrise, Blackridge was more than 200 miles behind me, and for the first time in 5 years, nobody knew where I was supposed to be. I stopped in Cedar Hollow, a quiet town surrounded by wooded hills and 2-lane roads, because exhaustion had made the decision for me. My shoulder had begun aching again after hours behind the wheel, and when I stepped out beside a small diner, I realized how tired I truly was. I ordered breakfast, found a motel nearby, and slept until late afternoon. The next morning, I visited a local clinic because the long drive had aggravated my recovering injury. That was where I met Dr. Caleb Morgan, a 38-year-old physician with an easy manner and the rare ability to ask questions without making them feel like demands. After examining my shoulder, he told me nothing serious had changed, but I needed rest and should continue the exercises from physical therapy. "Are you staying in town?" he asked. I looked toward the window. "I do not know yet." Caleb nodded as though uncertainty were a perfectly acceptable answer. "Then decide when you are ready." Those words followed me outside. For years, nearly every major decision in my life had been connected to Alexander, Blackridge, or what the pack required. Nobody had asked what I wanted without attaching someone else's needs to the question. Cedar Hollow was small enough that I could walk through most of downtown in 15 minutes. There was a grocery store, a family-owned cafe, a hardware shop, and a bookstore with a handwritten sign asking for part-time help. I went inside intending only to browse. 40 minutes later, I had a job. The owner needed someone to organize inventory, create window displays, and help with the store's social media. When she discovered I could draw, she asked whether I could design bookmarks for children's reading events. For the first time since the coronation, I felt useful without being useful to an alpha. I rented a furnished apartment above a bakery 3 blocks away. It had 1 bedroom, uneven hardwood floors, and windows overlooking Main Street. It was nothing like my rooms at Blackridge, but when I placed my sketchbook on the kitchen table, the apartment became mine in a way the larger rooms I had left behind never had. That evening, I finally unfolded the speech from my coat pocket. The paper was creased from the journey. I read the lines about loyalty, trust, and choosing a future together. Then I turned the page over and drew the view outside my new window. I did not destroy the speech. I wanted to remember the person who had written it, because he had not been foolish for believing in love. He had simply believed someone else's promises more than his own instincts. My phone remained turned off inside a kitchen drawer. I knew Alexander would be searching eventually. I knew Blackridge would have questions. But for one night, none of those questions belonged to me. I made tea, opened the window a few inches, and listened to Cedar Hollow settling into silence. I had arrived there wounded, unemployed, and uncertain of everything except what I had left behind. Yet when I looked at the blank pages remaining in my sketchbook, uncertainty no longer looked like emptiness. It looked like space. 3 weeks after I disappeared, Alexander was still leaving the hallway light on outside my empty room. I learned that much later, along with everything else that happened at Blackridge while I was teaching myself how to live without him. The coronation had achieved exactly what the council wanted. The alliance with the Cross family stabilized negotiations, business agreements moved forward, and publicly, Alexander appeared to have made the responsible choice. Privately, the victory began collapsing almost immediately. He had expected me to be angry. He had expected accusations, arguments, perhaps days of silence before he could explain why he believed the arrangement was necessary. What he had never prepared for was absence. My phone remained disconnected. My bank account showed no activity he could trace because I had taken enough cash to start over. I had left no forwarding address. Alexander contacted people I knew, but nobody could tell him where I had gone. Every evening, he returned to rooms that looked increasingly unfamiliar without my belongings scattered through them. Madeline noticed the change before the council did. She had never believed Alexander loved her, but she had assumed I understood the political arrangement. When she discovered I had not been told, her attitude toward him changed. "You let him walk into that room without knowing?" she asked him one evening. Alexander tried to explain that he intended to speak with me afterward. Madeline stared at him in disbelief. "After hundreds of people watched you replace him?" Alexander had no answer. Then she gave him something that made the silence worse. My speech. I had apparently dropped it near my chair when I left the ceremonial hall, and one of the staff members had given it to Madeline. She placed the folded pages on Alexander's desk. He recognized my handwriting before opening them. The first line described leadership as the courage to stand beside the person who had stood beside you when nobody was watching. Alexander read every word. He read about the future I believed we were building, about trust that mattered more than rank, and about my hope that Blackridge could become a place where loyalty was chosen rather than demanded. At the bottom, I had written a private sentence meant only for him. I thanked Alexander for making me believe I would never have to earn my place beside him. According to Madeline, he sat alone with those pages for nearly an hour. Meanwhile, my life in Cedar Hollow was becoming unexpectedly ordinary. I worked 5 days a week at the bookstore, continued therapy for my shoulder, and spent evenings drawing at the kitchen table. The owner began selling postcards made from my illustrations, and customers started asking whether I could create more. Caleb occasionally stopped by for coffee after his clinic shift, but he never questioned me about where I had come from. That kindness made Cedar Hollow feel safer than any grand promise ever had. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the bookstore window and realized I looked different. Not happier exactly, but lighter. I was no longer waiting for Alexander to explain why I mattered. 200 miles away, he was finally reading words I had written when I still believed I did. The crown had given him everything the council promised. The speech in his hands showed him exactly what it had taken away. By the 5th week after I left Blackridge, Madeline Cross had reached a conclusion Alexander had been avoiding since the night of the coronation. She asked him to meet privately in the council chamber after everyone else had gone home, then placed the Luna insignia on the long wooden table between them. "I am stepping down," she said. Alexander stared at the silver emblem. "The agreement requires you to remain through the end of the alliance review. Then change the agreement." Alexander reminded her how many negotiations depended on cooperation between their families, but Madeline did not argue about politics. "You keep talking as if the agreement did this," she said. "It did not. The council did not make you hide the truth from Ethan. My family did not make you let him walk into that ceremony believing he belonged beside you. You made that choice." Alexander went silent. Madeline had never pretended their arrangement was romantic, and she refused to let him turn her into either the reason for his mistake or the solution to it. Over the following days, she worked with both councils to restructure the alliance around trade and shared resources instead of a ceremonial partnership. When the announcement became public, Madeline accepted responsibility for her own participation without mentioning me by name. Alexander did the same, but removing the arrangement brought him no relief. For weeks, he had told himself that political pressure had trapped him between Blackridge and the person he loved. Once Madeline stepped away and the alliance remained intact, that excuse disappeared. The truth was simpler and uglier. Alexander had believed he could hurt me first, and explain himself later because somewhere inside him, he had assumed I would still be waiting. In Cedar Hollow, I knew none of this. My days had developed a rhythm I had never expected to enjoy. I opened the bookstore 3 mornings each week, designed new illustrated bookmarks in the afternoons, and spent evenings rebuilding the portfolio I had neglected while living at Blackridge. My shoulder had improved enough that Caleb reduced my appointments, which should have meant I saw less of him, but by then we had become friends. Sometimes he joined me for coffee after work. He never treated my silence like a mystery he deserved to solve. One evening, he asked why I always chose the table facing the front door. I almost gave him an easy answer. Instead, I said, "I spent a long time expecting someone else to decide what happened next." Caleb considered that, then nodded. "And now?" I looked through the cafe window at Main Street glowing beneath the evening lights. "Now I am trying to stop expecting anyone." Back at Blackridge, Alexander finally stopped searching through influence and started looking through memory. He studied places I had mentioned over the years, old travel routes, bookstores I had saved online, small towns I once said looked peaceful. Then he remembered a postcard pinned above my old desk. Cedar Hollow. I had bought it during a road trip years earlier because I liked the watercolor illustration on the front. Alexander found the town on a map, more than 200 miles away. He did not call the council. He did not send staff. The next morning, he drove there alone. Just before noon, his car entered Cedar Hollow while I stood behind the bookstore counter arranging a display of children's books. I had spent 5 weeks learning how to live without waiting for Alexander Hayes. Neither of us knew that he was now less than 3 blocks away. Alexander found the bookstore at 11:57 that morning, but finding me turned out to be easier than deciding whether he still had the right to walk through the door. I was standing behind the front counter beneath warm pendant lights, arranging a display of children's books beside bookmarks printed with my own illustrations. Through the window, I looked healthier than the Omega he remembered from Blackridge. My shoulder no longer forced me to move carefully, and when an elderly customer said something that made me laugh, Alexander realized he had not heard that sound in weeks. He remained across Main Street, watching a life continue perfectly well without him. That was where Caleb found him. The doctor had stopped for coffee before heading back to the clinic and noticed the unfamiliar man staring toward the bookstore. "You looking for someone?" Caleb asked. Alexander hesitated. "Ethan Cole." Caleb's expression became cautious. "Who are you?" Alexander looked through the window again. "Someone who taught him how to leave." Caleb studied him for a moment. "Then maybe you should ask yourself whether finding him means you get to interrupt what he built afterward." Alexander could have responded with rank or authority. Instead, he nodded. "I have been asking myself that since I parked." Inside, I turned toward the window while carrying a stack of books, and everything inside me went still. Alexander stood across the street in a dark coat, hands at his sides, looking nothing like the untouchable alpha who had stood before Blackridge 5 weeks earlier. For several seconds neither of us moved. Then he crossed the street. My first instinct was to leave through the back entrance. I did not. Cedar Hollow had become my home, and I refused to run from my own workplace because Alexander had finally found it. He entered quietly and stopped several feet from the counter. "Ethan." Hearing my name in his voice reopened something I had worked hard to close. "How did you find me?" "A postcard you kept above your desk." I remembered it immediately. "You searched my room." I searched for anything that might tell me you were safe. Those are not the same thing. Alexander lowered his eyes. No. They are not. I waited for explanations about the council, the alliance, or Madeline. None came. Instead, he said, I should have told you before the ceremony. I should have asked what you wanted before deciding what you could survive. I did neither. The apology was better than the explanation I had once expected, which made it more dangerous. Madeline stepped down. He continued. The arrangement is over. I felt almost nothing at the news. That surprised both of us. You think that changes what happened? No. Then why are you here? Alexander looked directly at me. Because I wanted to know you were all right. Now you know. His face tightened, but he accepted the boundary. Yes. He stepped backward toward the door. I will leave. I had imagined this reunion during sleepless nights, and in every version Alexander demanded that I return or tried to convince me that love erased betrayal. Instead, he opened the door and stopped. I am staying at the motel outside town tonight. If you want to talk, I will be there. If you do not, I will drive back tomorrow morning. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear down Main Street and realized the balance between us had changed. Alexander had finally found me, but for the first time in our relationship, what happened next depended entirely on whether I chose to be found. I waited until 7:30 that evening before walking to the motel, and every step there felt like an argument between the person who still loved Alexander and the person who had finally learned how to live without him. He was sitting alone in the small lobby when I arrived, still wearing the dark sweater and coat from earlier. The moment he saw me, he stood. Thank you for coming. I did not come to make this easier for you. I know. We moved to a quiet seating area near the window, and Alexander waited for me to speak first. Why did you really come here? I asked. Because I want you to come home. There it was, the answer I had expected. Strangely, hearing it no longer pulled me toward him. Home? I repeated. Blackridge. That is your home, Alexander. His expression shifted. It was yours too. No. It was where I built my life around yours. He started to respond, but I continued. You keep saying you lost me. You did not lose me. You let me go. The words settled between us. You made a decision about my future without asking me. Then you expected me to remain available, while you explained why humiliating me was necessary. Alexander looked down at his hands. You are right. I did not disappear because I wanted you to chase me. I left because staying would have taught me that my place beside you existed only until someone more useful appeared. His face tightened. Madeline was never more important to me than you. Then that makes what you did worse. Alexander looked up sharply. If you loved her, at least I could understand why you chose her. But you chose an arrangement you did not even want because it was convenient for everyone except me. He had no defense left, and for once, he did not invent one. I thought protecting Blackridge was my responsibility. It is. But loving me was also a responsibility once you asked me to trust you. Silence filled the lobby. Outside, headlights moved along the two-lane road. Alexander finally said, I cannot undo that night. No. And ending the arrangement does not repair what I did. No. He took a slow breath. Then tell me what I can do. Months earlier, I would have given him a list. Apologize publicly. Choose me. Bring me home. Promise never to leave. Now those answers felt like another kind of cage. I do not know, I said. That is something you need to figure out without making me responsible for your redemption. Alexander absorbed that quietly. Do you still love me? The question hurt because the answer remained simple. Yes. Hope appeared in his eyes, and I stopped it before it could become expectation. But loving you does not mean I trust you. His expression softened with something closer to grief than disappointment. I understand. Do you? I asked. Because tomorrow you are going back to Blackridge without me. Alexander remained still for several seconds, then nodded. All right. No argument. No alpha command. No promise that he would wait forever. Just acceptance. I stood to leave. Alexander followed only far enough to open the lobby door. Cold evening air touched my face. Ethan, he said. I turned. I am sorry I made you believe being loved by me required accepting whatever I decided. I looked at the man I had once planned my entire future around. Then become someone who never makes another person feel that way. The next morning, Alexander drove back to Blackridge alone. For the first time, I did not watch him leave wondering when he would return. The question had changed. It was no longer whether Alexander could win me back. It was whether he could become better even if he never did. Alexander returned to Blackridge without sending me another message, and for nearly 2 months, I heard nothing from him. At first, the silence felt familiar enough to make me suspicious. Then I began hearing his name from people who had no idea I was listening. A former Blackridge resident visited the bookstore while traveling through Cedar Hollow and mentioned that the council had changed its partnership rules. A week later, Caleb showed me a regional newspaper article describing reforms Alexander had introduced. Political lunar arrangements could no longer be approved without the explicit consent of everyone involved. Future mates of pack leaders would retain independent property, employment, and financial rights. Major alliance decisions would require broader council review instead of resting almost entirely with the Alpha. None of the changes mentioned me. Alexander never contacted me to claim credit. That mattered. Back at Blackridge, he was apparently rebuilding systems that had once allowed him to convince himself that authority and responsibility were the same thing. Several senior council members resisted. Alexander did not remove them or silence them. He made them debate the reforms openly, then accepted restrictions on his own authority as part of the agreement. Madeline supported the changes from the cross side, transforming the alliance into something neither of them had needed a ceremonial bond to maintain. For the first time, Alexander was changing Blackridge without knowing whether I would ever see the result. Meanwhile, Cedar Hollow had become more than the place where I recovered. The bookstore owner increased my hours managing community events, my illustrations were selling steadily, and I signed a small contract to create artwork for a children's reading program. My shoulder had healed enough that Caleb officially ended my treatment. Life was good. That was what made my next decision so difficult. I no longer needed Alexander. The realization should have closed the door permanently. Instead, it made me wonder whether choosing him freely might finally be possible. One Sunday morning, I opened my sketchbook and found the drawing I had made from my apartment window on my first night in Cedar Hollow. Behind it was the folded speech from the coronation. I read it again. The words no longer embarrassed me. I still believed in loyalty. I still believed leadership required trust. Alexander had failed those beliefs, but I had survived his failure without abandoning my own. 3 days later, I requested a week away from the bookstore. Caleb drove me to the small rental office where I picked up a car. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No." He smiled. "That sounds healthier than pretending you are." The drive to Blackridge took a little over 3 hours. Every familiar mile brought back memories, but they no longer controlled me. Near sunset, I passed the boundary sign and expected my chest to tighten. Instead, I felt strangely calm. I had not told Alexander the first was coming. Nobody had summoned me. No council agreement required my presence. I parked near Blackridge Hall and stepped out carrying only an overnight bag and my sketchbook. Alexander emerged from the building several minutes later, speaking with 2 council members. He stopped the instant he saw me. Surprise crossed his face, followed by something dangerously close to hope, but he did not move toward me. That restraint answered a question I had carried for more than 200 miles. I walked across the courtyard until only a few feet separated us. "Ethan," he said quietly. I looked toward the hall where another Luna had once been placed beside him, then back at the man who had finally learned to change without knowing whether I would return. "I heard Blackridge is different." Alexander held my gaze. I am trying to make it different. I nodded. Then show me. For the first time since I disappeared, I was standing in Blackridge again. The difference was simple. This time, nobody had brought me back. I had chosen the road myself. I stayed in Blackridge for 6 days before Alexander asked me for anything, and even then, what he offered was not the future I had expected. He showed me the revised council charter, introduced me to representatives who had helped create the new protections, and answered every question without pretending the reforms erased what had happened. He never asked where I slept in Cedar Hollow, whether Caleb was important to me, or when I planned to return permanently. On the 6th evening, Blackridge held a community gathering in the same hall where I had once watched another person take the place I thought would be mine. Walking through those doors again should have felt like reopening a wound. Instead, I noticed something immediately. The Luna seat beside Alexander was empty. There was no ceremonial insignia waiting on it. No announcement had been prepared. Alexander addressed the room briefly, speaking about the reforms and acknowledging that leadership without consent could become control even when disguised as duty. He did not mention my disappearance, or turn my pain into evidence of his growth. When the gathering ended, I found him alone near the windows overlooking the courtyard. "You left the seat empty," I said. "It is not mine to fill." That answer stayed with me as we walked to his office. Alexander opened a drawer and removed the silver Luna insignia that had once belonged to the arrangement with Madeline. He placed it on the desk between us. Months earlier, seeing it would have reminded me only of humiliation. Now it looked surprisingly small. "I used to believe this was something the Alpha gave," Alexander said. "A title, a place, a promise. I was wrong." He pushed the insignia gently toward me but stopped before it reached my hand. "If you ever want it, the choice is yours. If you never want it, nothing about how I feel changes." I looked at him for a long moment. "And if I go back to Cedar Hollow tomorrow? Then I hope the bookstore keeps selling your illustrations." I almost laughed. "You know about those?" "Someone mentioned them. I did not investigate." "Good answer." Alexander smiled faintly, then became serious again. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I already forgive you." Surprise crossed his face. "That does not mean everything returns to what it was," I continued. "I do not want what we had. I disappeared because the person I was believed loving you meant fitting into your life. If I stand beside you again, I stand there because I chose it." Alexander nodded. "Then choose only when you are ready." I looked down at the silver insignia. For months, that symbol had represented everything taken from me. Now Alexander was offering it without expectation, and I finally understood that I did not need it to prove anything. I left it on the desk. Then I reached for his hand. Alexander looked at our joined fingers but did not tighten his grip until I did first. "This is all I can choose today," I said. "Then today is enough." We walked out of the office together, leaving the insignia behind. I would return to Cedar Hollow the following week. Alexander would visit when invited. Trust would return slowly, through ordinary choices rather than ceremonies. Maybe one day I would stand beside him before Blackridge again, and maybe I would never wear the title I had once wanted so desperately. Either future could belong to me now. Outside, evening light stretched across the courtyard as Alexander and I walked side by side, either ahead of the other. Months earlier, I had left Blackridge alone because someone else had chosen my place for me. This time, I stayed beside Alexander for one simple reason. I was free to leave, and I chose to take the next step with him.